We have a holiday coming up this weekend, and it's called President's Day. And we're specifically remembering two very important presidents from history. So I'm going to read, this book has both of them in it, but I'm going to read one today and then one for tomorrow. So this is the book that I'm going to be reading to you. It's called President's Day. Let's Meet George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. So George Washington, he's this one, was our first president that we ever had in the United States. And Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president, but he was known for getting rid of slavery. And slavery, very bad, so when he got rid of that, he was very well known for that. George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. So today I'm going to read you about George Washington, and tomorrow I'll read the second part of this book about Abraham Lincoln. George Washington was born on February 27, 1732 in the British colony of Virginia. At that time, there was no country called the United States of America. There were 12 American colonies that belonged to Great Britain. One more colony was added after George Washington was born, making a total of 13. So those were the first 13 colonies. But we weren't even considered or named the United States yet. George's family moved to Ferry Farm when he was 6 years old. There, he loved to ride horseback over the hills and fields. George went to school as often as he could, but he usually did lessons at home, as most children did at that time. He liked math best. He also learned from adults around him. George liked to learn by watching and listening. So he does lessons at home just like you guys do. When George was 11 years old, his father died. After this, he spent much of his time with his brother Lawrence, who was 14 years older than George. Lawrence lived on a farm he had named Mount Vernon. Lawrence helped George improve his mind and his manners. He was a hero to George. With Lawrence's help, George learned to be a surveyor. He was given his first job at the age of 16. When George was 20, Lawrence died. This was a sad time for George. He decided to leave Mount Vernon and join Virginia's army. By the time he left the army 6 years later, he had become commander of the troops. At age 26, George married Martha Curtis, a widow with 2 children. Martha was very wealthy. For her wedding, she wore shoes with diamond buckles and a dress of white silk. George was handsome in his blue jacket lined with red silk. Washington returned to Mount Vernon with his new family. He built several additions to their hilltop home overlooking the Potomac River. George read all the latest books on farming. He liked trying new ideas. The Washingtons spent 16 peaceful years on Mount Vernon, but trouble was on its way. People in the American colonies thought the British were treating them unfairly. A man was called to discuss the problem. Washington watched and listened. When he arrived at the second meeting, Washington was wearing his old army uniform. Everyone knew what that meant. Washington thought the time had come to fight for freedom from the British. Washington was asked to lead the American army. He accepted the job, but he refused to accept pay. The Revolutionary War lasted 8 years. For a while, it looked as if the British would win. But General Washington was clever. A British general called him the Old Fox. Washington led his soldiers to victory. At last, the American people had won freedom for their country. After the war, Washington left the army and returned to Mount Vernon. For 5 years. He was happy with just to be a farmer. Then once again, Washington was asked to help his country. The United States of America needed a president. Everyone thought Washington would do a good job. George Washington was elected as our first president in 1789. There were many problems facing the new country. President Washington tried to do what was right, even when it was not easy. He worked hard to make the country strong. Washington enjoyed planning a new capital city. He chose a site on the Potomac River across Mount Vernon. The city was later named Washington in his honor. After his second term as president, Washington returned home to Mount Vernon for the last time. 2 years later, on December 14th, 1799, he died. In 1885, the towering Washington Monument was dedicated to the memory of our first president. All right, so George Washington was our first president. This was before we even became the United States of America. And after we won the war against the British and became a free country, then he was able to become the president, and he was our president for 2 terms. All right.